Hello, I'm Sunderland Echo reporter Tony Gillan. As most Waysiders are aware, the city of Sunderland has lost many pubs and clubs over the years. Here is but a potted history of some of your favourites. We're standing outside the bridges where once there was a pub called the Upper Deck. It was an architectural gem, much in keeping with the multi-storey car park that then stood next to it. I remember it mainly, it was an S&N house, Scottish in Newcastle, and on a Saturday afternoon, long before I was old enough to drink, the inmates would stand outside, layering at passers-by from the skywalk and tipping the occasional tot of beer onto their heads. Great days. The pubs closed in those days at 3 o'clock, which for the management of the Upper Deck was probably a very good thing on a Saturday. Right, we're standing where High Street East begins, next to this roundabout, and over the road behind me was the Ship Inn, pointedly called. Perhaps Ship Inn was kind of an advertising ploy, because when a ship was in, the place was often replete with many ladies of negotiable virtue, I think the phrase is. Vaux Brewery stood behind me, more or less, exactly over the road. You may remember the Brewery Tap, in my opinion the finest pub on the list, and certainly the one that I missed the most. It went the same way as the brewery that it served in 1999. Annabels was a nightclub situated originally where Primark now stands, the top of Walworth Way, in what is now the Bridges. It was a second floor establishment. It moved in the late 1980s a very short distance to the area behind me. It was only recently demolished as a building. It was an old style glitter ball establishment and very popular back in the day. You would see the occasional celebrity in there even. This was a nightclub with a reputation for attracting a slightly more mature crowd. Indeed, some of its patrons were over 25 years old, which hardly warrants the uncharitable nickname it was given at the time. Really, Annabels. Not very nice. The sign behind me says venue. I really don't know which venue it refers to, but I remember this building being Q Club. For my money, this is the best club as was on this list. The music was certainly a cut above, and people who went in there, quite intellectual by comparison, whisper it. But I went in anyway. But if we're honest, the main allure of this place was that back in the day, it sold shots of spirits for 20 pence. 20 pence. I have to say that even back in the day, 20 pence wouldn't buy you anything then either. Chambers was a nightclub which opened in 1987, although the building is considerably older. Grade 2 listed Victorian, in fact, Hutchison's buildings. It occupied the ground floor and the first floor. Quite a standard nightclub really, but remembered by many for the overzealous use of its dry ice machine. They loved a bit of dry ice in Chambers. The old 29, sort of between the horrendous High Street Bats, if you remember those, and another pub just where I'm pointing now called Idles, the land that taste forgot. The old 29 was quite well known for putting on bands, very loud gigs, including by the Toy Dolls and Angelic Upstarts, and they were very loud. You could hear them clearly from the bus station in South Shields. The floor was inevitably covered in glass. No one ever seemed to return a glass to the bar or a bottle. I'm just old enough to remember it actually being open, although it was well known for serving anybody if you were over 3 feet tall. But I must say this, I didn't think it was a very good pub at all. I think people have a great attachment to things that no longer exist, but each to our own. We're now standing in Roker, outside, over the road indeed, from what was the Red Lion pub which stood here for many years. It was a particularly thriving concern when Sunderland were at home, particularly in the Roker Park days. Indeed, it got very busy. I used to stand outside it myself as a youngster. My dad would say, "Wait outside this pub, I'll be back in 2 hours." And I did that while everyone passing pinched my chips. The Stadium of Light opened in 1997, and I thought that would be a boon for the Red Lion because it's even closer. However, it was not to be. It closed down in around 2010 and was demolished the year after. Even in its last days, topless barmaids in the upstairs could not save it. Genevieve's is a nightclub I remember only as a youth. I never went in as an adult. There used to be a young hooligans night every Tuesday, and I used to attend that. It's now been replaced by this beautiful building you can see behind us. It was the spiritual home of a vibrant robotic dancing scene, which Sunderland was famed for back then, and many a heart as well as circuit was broken. I once won a stack of vinyl records when I embarked on the stage and was able to spell Genevieve's to a stunned audience. The only one I can remember, I'd never heard of any of them apart from On the Wings of Love by Jeffrey Osborne. I gave it to my Auntie Anna. I'm standing in a place which many of you probably don't realise is called Dixons Square. This was home to quite an infamous nightclub called eponymously Dixons, one which I never set foot in, and with good reason. It was apparently the easiest nightclub in the known world in which to get into a fight. Patrons are said to have moved from here to Tijuana and Colombia in order to avoid violence. It was knocked down with shameless disregard for our architectural heritage, maybe about 20 years ago now. Others contend that it was quite a swish establishment where young executives would meet of an evening for mottled oysters and champagne. But they were probably lying. Behind me, in this nicely landscaped part of Ford Estate, once stood a pub, the Jovial Friar. No idea why it was called the Jovial Friar. It had a lovely picture of a fat jolly monk outside, to emphasise the point. It's knocked down, I believe, in the 1990s. It's a well thought of pub. It was very popular with locals, but it wasn't quite enough to save it, unfortunately. Incidentally, this area was reputed at one time to have been a hotspot for paranormal activity. Quite obviously it wasn't, but it's a nice story. The house behind me was actually a police house at one time, which must have been in favour of the landlord of the pub. And behind, well, straight ahead of me was what a lot of Ford Estate people remember as being Milburns and newsagents. The Jovial Friar itself looked much like an ordinary house, but on the side of it, around about where I'm standing here, was an off-licence. Very popular it was too. Here in Bedford Street there was once a pub called the Garrick's Head, but better remembered for a nightclub next door, the Blue Monkey. It's quite an historic building. It was built in 1855 as a theatre, the Royal Theatre. Indeed, right to the end it still had a bust of Shakespeare above its entrance outside. It was also obvious that once you went inside that it had been a theatre. Later the Royal Cinema, and then a bingo hall, and eventually the Blue Monkey nightclub. It was a good nightclub. It was a cheap night on Thursday, so that was inevitably occupied by students and studenty music, but it's also well remembered for its rave nights. Sadly, it's probably best remembered for the infamous way in which it all ended. It was the scene of a murder inquiry early in 1992, and in 1994 it was set fire to, burned to the ground and eventually demolished. The fire could have been a lot worse, as there was actually a petrol station next door. It didn't get quite that out of hand. It was replaced by the New Monkey in Pallion some years later, and that closed to the lament of precisely no one. Here in Fawcett Street, the double door on your right behind me was the entrance to Bourbon Street. It didn't last very long. It was around in the first half of the 1990s for 2 or 3 years. Perfectly decent place, but just didn't keep up. This street, as all the best people know, is Frederick Street. The club we're about to refer to was mentioned, indeed it was the subject of a song by the Toy Dolls. In 1984 they had a smash hit, number 3, with Nelly the Elephant. The B-side was a song called Fisticuffs in Frederick Street, and it name-checked Foster's Nightclub, which was, I regret to say, one of the buildings behind me, but I'm not sure which one. It later became Heroes, the joke of the time being that you had to be one to go in. The building behind me is Lambton House. It's now an office block, but it used to be a pub called the Bridge Hotel, and it has quite an interesting history. The pub stood on the corner of High Street West and Sunderland Street, as indeed the building still does. It was built in 1797 and it is now Grade 2 listed. It was a house originally for the Lambton family. It became, according to English Heritage, a pub in 1820. Charles Dickens allegedly popped in for a couple in 1852. He certainly appeared at the nearby Lyceum Theatre at that time. The pub became less popular as the years rolled by, and by the 1990s was struggling. And it's now an office block. It's not been a bar since its landlord was murdered on the premises in 1998. Well, here in a rather noisy home side, behind me is a nightclub which opened I think in 1986 called Bentleys. We're cheating a bit here because clearly it's still trading as the excellent Illusions. It was beloved of apprentices of any gender on a Saturday night. They would all gather to worship their patron saints, all three of them, Stock, Aitken and Waterman. On a really good night, they might play a song here. The site now occupied by Sunderland College was once upon a time Fusion. This was before my time as well, nightclubbing. It was a classic Saturday night favourite place apparently. The overwhelming aroma of allspice and bleach, glitter balls and so forth. Many a person would get in there and saddle up and ride your pony. Sometimes they got quite famous turns on, one of whom was Shack Attack. Fino's, along with Annabels, is probably the best remembered on our list. Now the port of call, it was occupied the first floor of the building behind me. Popular back in the day among footballers, among other people. Footballers then loved only music with a sexy sax in the middle. And there's another connection here to local heroes, the Toy Dolls. They had a smash hit, number 93 hit in 1995 with a song called simply She Goes to Fino's, remembered by people who went to Fino's. Here in Merton Street there was a club that few people remember called Rascals. It was knocked down with little lament some years ago alongside an unappealing multi-storey car park to make way for Sunderland Software City. All I remember about it was that legendary DJ Michael Story, yes, Michael Story, had an evening called Slime Night every Monday featuring alternative music. So alternative in fact that no one except Michael Story had ever heard this music before or since. It was a particular favourite as Bentleys among people who operated circular saws.